Shalom Havarim, James Trim here. Today I want to talk with you about and go through together Hebrews chapter 10, and we're going to examine Hebrews chapter 10 as a prime example of a formal style of Midrash that's found in the Midrashic rabbinic literature. A formal style of Midrash called a Proem Homiletic Midrash. And I think this will help you better understand what Hebrews chapter 10 is saying, and particularly from a Jewish perspective. Before we get going, I need to ask people to please donate to support these videos. We especially need your help in the next 24 hours. By the end of the day tomorrow, we must raise $475 to keep our account from plunging into the negative and starting a cascade of returned items. So if you possibly can donate, this is a really good time to donate. Donate what you can. No donation is too small, and any donation is better than no donation. You can send donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. That's donations@wnae.org. Or you can just click on the donate link in the video description. Also, I need to ask everybody to please like these videos. We've got a great like to view ratio on our videos, so help us keep that up. Please subscribe to this channel. It's at absolutely no cost to you to subscribe to this channel. Click on that notification bell so you'll get notifications when new videos come out. Let us know what you think of our videos in the comments, and participate in the discussions in the comments section. These are all things that YouTube looks at to decide which videos to recommend to new viewers, and we want to get recommended to new viewers. Also, please share this video in email with your friends, on Facebook, in relevant Facebook groups, Twitter, any kind of social media in which you participate. Share these videos and help us get the word out that way. Okay, also we have frequently, as is the case today, handouts for our videos where you can follow along, and it's a PDF file which you can download from the video description, and you can follow along with us. Okay, so our handouts today starts out, this is going to go through Hebrews chapter 10. What we have here is a literal translation from the Aramaic Peshitta text, and that's going to be important as we go along, as you'll find out. I always like to study the books of the so-called New Testament from the Hebrew and Aramaic sources, the ancient Hebrew and Aramaic sources, because they allow me to study it in the language in which it was written. Whether or not it was written in Hebrew or Aramaic is debatable, but they're very similar languages. Okay, let's begin with chapter 1, verse 1. And the Proem Homiletic Midrash actually starts in verse 5, but there's some material we should cover in the first 4 verses before we get to that, that kind of sets the stage for the Midrash. Now we're gonna so let's just go ahead and cover those first. It says, "For the Torah had in it shadows of good things to come, not the very substance of the things themselves. Because of this, although the same sacrifices were offered every year, they were never able to perfect those who offered them." Now, this has given rise to a misunderstanding by many Christians that that Paul is saying here we shouldn't observe Torah. That the idea is that since the Torah is only a shadow and not the very substance, it's not important whether we keep it or not. That's not what Paul is saying. In fact, in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, talking about it says the Messiah is our Passover, and then he says, therefore let us keep the feast. Okay, so Paul does not take that view, and we have here in a little box under this verse a quote from Philo of Alexandria on his book on the migration of Abraham, in which he, in fact, addresses that very false ideology that because the Torah is symbolic of certain realities, that if we understand those realities about which the Torah is symbolic, it no longer becomes important whether we observe Torah or not. And so he writes in sections 89 through 93 of On the Migration of Abraham, he says, and who was Philo? Philo was a first century Jewish writer who lived in Alexandria, Egypt. He said, for there are some men who, looking upon written laws as symbols of things appreciable by the intellect, have studied some things with superfluous accuracy, and have treated others with neglectful indifference, whom I should blame for their levity. For they ought to attend to both classes of things, applying themselves both to an accurate investigation of invisible things, and also an irreproachable observance of those laws which are notorious. Now, notorious here doesn't mean what we typically mean today when we say notorious. It doesn't mean of bad reputation. It means worthy of note. Verse 90, but now men living solitarily by themselves as if they were in a desert, or else as if they were mere souls unconnected with the body, and as if they had no knowledge of any city or village, or house, or in short of any company of men whatsoever, overlook what appears to the many to be true, and seek for plain naked truth itself, whom the sacred scriptures teach not to neglect a good reputation, and not to break through any of the established customs which divine men of greater wisdom than any other time, any in our time, have enacted or established. For although the seventh day is a lesson to teach us the power which exists in the uncreated God, and also that the creature is entitled to rest from his labors, it does not follow that on that account we ought to abrogate the laws which are established respecting it, so as to light a fire, or till the land, or carry burdens, or bring accusations, or conduct suits of law, or demand a restoration of a deposit, or exact the repayment of a debt, or do any of the other things that are usually permitted at times which are not days of festival. Nor does it follow that because the feast is the symbol of the joy of the soul and of its gratitude towards God, that we are to repudiate the assemblies ordained at the periodic seasons of the years. Nor because the rite of circumcision is an emblem of the excision of pleasures and all of the passions, and the destruction of that impious opinion according to which the mind has imagined itself to be by itself competent to produce offspring, does it follow that we are to annul the law which has been enacted about circumcision. Since we shall neglect the laws about the due observance of ceremonies in the temple, and numbers of others too, if we exclude all figurative interpretation and attend only to those things which are expressly ordained in plain words. But it is right to think that this class of things resembles the body, and the other class the soul. Therefore, just as we take care of the body, because it is the abode of the soul, so also must we take care of the laws that are enacted in plain terms. For while they are regarded, those things also will be more clearly understood, of which these laws are the symbols. And in the same way, one will escape blame and accusation from men in general. So what Philo is saying here is that the actual laws of the Torah are like a body. Their symbolic meaning is like the soul of the Torah. And what he is saying is that we must care for the body because it's the abode of the soul. If the body dies, the soul no longer inhabits the body. And if we don't observe the Torah, then the symbolism of the Torah no longer inhabits the Torah. In other words, if we don't observe Torah, then it's not symbolic of anything because we're not observing it. It's not teaching us the symbolism in question because we're not observing. But if we are observing it, we are living that symbolism, and it is teaching us that symbolism. So the fact that the Torah is a shadow of the good things to come is all the more reason we should keep it. And in fact, if we cease to keep it, it ceases to be symbolic of anything because we're not keeping it. Okay. Verse 2. If they had perfected, then doubtless they would have ceased their offerings, because their conscience no longer troubles them with sins who once have been cleansed. But by the sacrifices they brought their sins to remembrance every year. The Greek says that the sacrifices continue as a remembrance every year. In verse 4, the blood of bulls and of goats is not able to cleanse sins. Okay, those are the first 4 opening verses. And then they lead us to verse 5, which says, because of this. So, because of what? Because of the things that were just said. Okay, leading into that. But chapter 10, verses 5 through 39 are written in a form that is a formal form of Midrash used in the rabbinic literature. It's called a Proem Homiletic Midrash, and it's a Proem Homiletic Midrash on Psalms chapter 40, verses 7 through 9, but it's really not. It's really a Proem Homiletic Midrash on Habakkuk 2:4, because the way a Proem Homiletic Midrash works is that it takes 2 verses and it connects them in a way that is surprising, okay? And it uses key words to connect these 2 verses, or these 2 passages, may be a better phrase for it, because not necessarily a verse, but 2 passages from the Tanakh are joined together using Hillel's second rule, which is Gezara Shavah, the equivalence of expressions. In other words, key words that connect the 2 verses. And the way a Proem Homiletic Midrash works is that it introduces the Midrash not with the passage that's really being expounded upon, but with a seemingly unrelated passage. Oftentimes, as is the case here, the seemingly unrelated passage is from the Ketuvim. And that's the case here. It's from Psalms chapter 40, verses 7 through 9, or verses 6 through 8, depending on whether you're using a Christian or Jewish version, basically. And so verses 5 through 7 of Hebrews 10 quotes a version of Psalm chapter 40, verses 7 through 9. Now, the reason I say a version of it is because we did a whole video in the past does the New Testament quote the Septuagint? And one of the things that we learned in that video is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we discovered that many of the Tanakh manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them agreed with the Masoretic text almost exactly. And some of them departed from the Masoretic text and agreed with the Septuagint. And in some cases, they also, by the way, will agree with the Aramaic Peshitta. There's an Aramaic Peshitta version of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh. Okay. So what I did was I have done here is I've taken the relevant passage of Psalms 40 as it appears in the Hebrew, in the Aramaic Peshitta, and in the Greek Septuagint. And I've put them in parallel columns together in a little chart underneath where they're quoted in verses 5 through 7 in Hebrews. So there are some differences you'll notice between the three readings, okay? So the Hebrew says, sacrifice and offerings you did not desire. My ears have you opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings have you not requested. Then said I, lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do your will, O my Elohim, and your Torah is within my heart. Now, Paul, when he quotes this, by the way, he truncates the quote. He does not include the part that says, O my Elohim, and your Torah is within my heart. He doesn't include the passage, the phrase, and your Torah is within my heart. But he knows that his readers know it, because in these days, in the Second Temple era, books were very expensive. They had to be hand copied. There was no printing press. So people had to have these passages memorized. And also, they didn't go to the movies. They didn't read novels. They learned the scriptures, and so they learned them. They memorized these things, and they knew these passages were very familiar to them. So when Paul quotes the passage in part, it brings to mind the complete passage to the reader. There are a couple of differences to be pointed out here in the different versions. Is that, for example, in the Hebrew and the Aramaic, it says, ears you have cut from me, but in the Greek Septuagint it says, but a body you have prepared me. Now, that doesn't mean that only the Septuagint had that reading. The Septuagint would have been based on and translated from a Hebrew manuscript in ancient times, in the Second Temple era, that had the reading, but a body you have prepared me. Okay? Very important here is that in the Aramaic Peshitta, and I italicized and bolded these words for you in verse 7, where it says, sacrifice and offering you did not desire. And then in verse 9, where it says, I desire to do your will, the words desire and will are all the same word in Aramaic. They're not the same word in the Hebrew text. They're not the same word in the Greek. But in the Aramaic Peshitta, they're all the same word. And in my translation here of Hebrews, it's you are not pleased with sacrifice and offerings. It's still the same word. I will do your will, Elohim, same word. Paul has truncated the quote. He doesn't say, I desire to do your will. He says, I will do your will. Okay. But it's the same word. And remember I said that a Proem Homiletic Midrash ties two passages together based on a key word or phrase. And this is the case. So if we go down to verses, all the way down to the bottom, verses 37 and 38, particularly verse 38, let's just stick with verse 38. Verse 38 is quoting Habakkuk 2:4, and it says, now the just shall live by my faith, and if he is discouraged, my soul will not be pleased with him. And that word pleased is the same Aramaic word that is the word that we found 3 times in Psalm 40, where it says, sacrifices and offerings you did not desire. In other words, you were not pleased with. I desire to do your will in verse 9. Okay, so he's connecting this to, for his soul has no pleasure in iniquity, and as it's quoted in Hebrews 38, now the just shall live by my faith, and if he is discouraged, my soul will not be pleased with him. So this is the connecting word. It's very important here because I put this again in a little chart comparing the three major versions, the Hebrew, the Aramaic Peshitta, and the Greek Septuagint. And the Hebrew doesn't even have a word corresponding to pleasure or please. The Hebrew says, behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him. Now, the question is, is the Aramaic Peshitta and the Greek based on the Greek Septuagint based on an alternate Hebrew text in the Second Temple era, or is it simply an interpretation? And if it's an interpretation, then what this is telling us is that Paul, in writing this, is using the Aramaic Peshitta text as his basis, because in the Aramaic Peshitta text, Habakkuk 2:4 is using the same word for pleasure that in the Aramaic text, Psalms 40, verses 7 through 9, are using for desire and your will. It's the same word in Aramaic. Okay, and this is the key word that connects and brings these all together. So now let's start to study this with this in mind, and we'll also see that one of the things that a Proem Homiletic Midrash does is it takes key words from the initial text. The initial text is called the text that is far. And the text at the end, the final text, is the text that is near. It's the text that is really at the very end. The midrashist, the composer of the midrash, is surprising you when he pops this final verse to you, and you realize this is what he's talking about, and this is what he's relating to. Okay. So, verse 8 in Hebrews chapter 10, above he said, you do not desire, and what I did, by the way, in your handout, is that I italicized and bold-faced the key phrases that are versions of his will, offering or offerings and sacrifices, and for sin. And in the Aramaic, the word for sin here, or the phrase for, the word for in the phrase for sin throughout this, and in the Peshitta, is in the Tanakh, Peshitta Tanakh, is a phrase that means instead of, in place of. Okay. Above, he said, you do not desire sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings that are for sins or instead of sins, those that are offered according to the Torah. And after, he said, behold, I come to do your will, Elohim. By this he annulled the first, that he might establish the second. For in his will we are sanctified by the offering of the body of Yeshua, the Messiah, once. Now, remember I said that Paul had truncated. If we go back and look at Psalms 40, verses 7 through 9, Paul has truncated the end of verse 9 in his quotation. Remember, the end of verse 9 says, and your Torah is within my heart. That's actually going to be an important phrase to the Midrash, as we'll find out. And it also tells us it's a poetic parallelism in verse 9. I desire to do your will, O my Elohim, and your Torah is within my heart. So the Torah is his will. My heart is my desire, and the Torah is his will. So if we read verses 7 through 9 with that in mind, sacrifice and offering you did not desire. Why? Why do you not desire sacrifice and offering? This is a Hebrew idiom. It means, it doesn't mean that it's like when Yeshua said, you have to learn to hate your parents and love me. It doesn't mean to hate your parents, okay? Here, it doesn't mean that Elohim didn't request sacrificial offerings. Obviously, he did. It's in the Torah. But what it does mean is it's not what he really wants. What he really wants is for us to observe the Torah His will is the Torah. Sacrifices and offerings are instead of Torah. In other words, when we sin, they're for sin. So sin is the transgression of the Torah. So he doesn't want us to transgress Torah and then give sacrifices and offerings. He wants us to observe Torah so that we don't have to have a sacrifice for sin. We don't have to go make a sin offering because we didn't sin. Okay, that's what he's saying here. And this is what the topic is as we move forward, as you'll see. So then when it says in verse 9 of Hebrews 10, and after he said, "Behold, I come to do your will, Elohim," which is the Torah, by this he annulled the first that he might establish the second. In other words, if you observe the Torah, then you don't have to go make that sin offering for the sin that you committed, because you didn't do the sin, you did the Torah. So when it says this is so misunderstood in Christendom, this phrase, when it says, by this he annulled the first that he might establish the second, he's saying, no. I don't really want your sin offerings because I don't want you to sin. I want you to observe Torah so that you don't need a sin offering. All right. Verse 10, for in this his will, which in context of Psalms 40 verse 9 is the Torah, for in this his will we are sanctified by the offering of the body of Yeshua the Messiah once. Verse 11, for every high priest who stood and served daily offered the same sacrifices that were never able to cleanse sins. But this one offered one sacrifice for sins and sat down at the right hand of Elohim forever, quoting Psalm 110 verse 1. This is this quote from Psalm 110 verse 1 plays into Paul's overall teaching in Hebrews, because although we're only looking at chapter 10 as a midrash on Habakkuk 2:4 and Psalms 40, the overall the whole book of Hebrews is an extended Proem Homiletic Midrash on Psalm 110. Okay. And we'll do a whole teaching on that another time. Verse 13, and he remains there from now on until his enemies will be placed a footstool under his feet. Again, referencing Psalm 110. For with one offering he perfected those who were sacrificed by him forever. Now the Ruach HaKodesh also is a witness to us, for he said, and then it quotes Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 32 through 33, this is the covenant that I will give to them after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my Torah in their minds, and I will write it upon their hearts, and I will not remember their unrighteousness and their sins. That's chapter 10, verse 17. That is referring back to Psalms 40, verse 9, connected with it, which says in the second half of verse 9, and your Torah is within my heart. See, Paul truncated that. He didn't quote it when he quoted Psalms 40, but his audience knows it's there, because unlike you, they know what Psalm 40 said. It's in their, they've memorized it. So when Paul quotes most of a passage from Psalm 40, the rest of that passage comes to their mind. They know it. Verse 18, now where there is forsaking of sins, an offering that is for sins is not required. Oh, this is so important. This is generally translated, like in your King James versions and whatnot, where there is remission of sins. The Aramaic word for remission, or in place of remission here, is shuvkana. This is a word that means to forsake, to abandon, to leave behind. In fact, you may remember, this is the Aramaic word that's in Psalm 22, verse 1. It's a form of the same word, where it says, my God, or Eli, Eli, why have you forsaken me? And it's what Yeshua said in Aramaic when he was crucified, as he, just before he expired. He said, Lama, Lama, Eli, Eli, Lama, Eli, Eli, Lama Shabachthani. It's a form of the same word, Shabach, the Shin Beit Kuf root, and it means to abandon, to leave behind, to forsake. So verse 18 here says, now where there is a forsaking or an abandonment or a leaving behind of sins, an offering that is for sins is not required. This is a key verse in what Paul is trying to say here. So what Paul is trying to say here is that if you don't do the crime, you don't have to do the time. If you are observing Torah and you're forsaking transgression of the Torah, you're forsaking sins, then an offering that is for sins isn't required. Which is what Paul's point in, what David's point in Psalm 40 is. What the psalmist is saying in Psalm 40 is that I don't want your sacrifices and offerings, I want your obedience. I want you to observe Torah, not go do a sacrifice and offering because you didn't observe Torah. Okay, verse 19, we have therefore, my brothers, boldness in the entering of the sanctuary by the blood of Yeshua, and a path of life that is now introduced to us by the veil that was his flesh. And we have a high priest over the house of Elohim. Therefore, let us draw near with a true heart and with the confidence of faith, our hearts being sprinkled and pure from an evil conscience, and our body washed with pure water. This is reference back to the Torah in Exodus 24:8. By the way, we'll do a whole teaching in the future on Jeremiah. If I haven't already done it before, I can't remember all the videos that we've made, but there's a whole teaching to be done on the new covenant in Jeremiah 31 that we referenced there, because it's not a new covenant, it's a renewal of the covenant of the Torah. Verse 23, and let us persist in the confession of our hope and not waver, for he who promised to us is faithful. Verse 24, and let us look at one another with an encouragement to love and good works, and let us not forsake our assembly, as is the custom for some, but entreat one another, especially the more you see that day approaching. He's not talking about church attendance. He's talking about the temple, okay? Let us not forsake our assembly, as is the custom of some. He's saying, let's continue to go to the temple, okay? Also, there's a contrast here. Let us not forsake our assembly in verse 25, but in verse where was the verse? In verse 18, he says, now there is a forsaking of sins. So we're supposed to forsake sin, but by contrast, we're not supposed to forsake the gathering, the assembly of ourselves. We're not supposed to forsake the temple. Verse 25. Verse 26. For if by his will a man should sin after he has received knowledge of the truth, there is no longer a sacrifice that may be offered for sin, because the sacrifices and offerings are for the sins of ignorance. Verse 27, but a terrible judgment is prepared, and the zeal of fire that will devour the adversaries. Quoting Isaiah 26:11, which is important because he'll go on to quote another part of Isaiah 26 later. Verse 28, for if he who transgressed against the Torah of Moshe died at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, quoting Deuteronomy 17:6 and 19:15, without mercy, how much more punishment do you suppose will he receive who has trampled on the Son of Elohim and has reckoned the blood of his covenant, quoting Exodus 24:8, by which he was sanctified like that of any man, has despised the Spirit of grace. This blood of his covenant is referring to the covenant of Torah in Exodus 24:8. So here we're referring to, Paul is using something called Kol V'Chomer, the first rule of Hillel, light and heavy, where 2 things are compared, and a point is made that if something is true of A, it must even be more true of B, because B is of greater weight than A. It's often using the phrase, how much more so? So Paul is saying that if a person who transgressed the Torah died at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses without mercy, how much more so? What greater punishment do you suppose will he receive who has trampled the Son of Elohim and has reckoned the blood of his covenant, which was sanctified like that of any man, is despised the Spirit of grace? You know him who said, vengeance is mine and I will repay, and again Yahweh will judge his people, again quoting Torah, Deuteronomy 32:35 through 36. None of this has to do with abandoning Torah. It has to do with abandoning the transgression of Torah. Verse 31, it is very terrible to fall into the hands of the Elohim of life. Remember, therefore, the first days, those in which you received immersion and endured a great contest of sufferings with reproach and with afflictions, and that you were spectacles also, who were made partakers with men who endured these. And you were sorry for those who were bound, and you endured the robbery of your possessions with joy, because you knew that you had a possession in heaven that is greater and does not pass away. Therefore, do not lose the boldness that you have, for it will have a great reward. For patience is necessary for you to do the will of Elohim, which is what? The Torah, and to receive the promise. Verse 37, because it is a little, even a very short time, that he who comes will come and will not delay. That is a merging of 2 passages, Habakkuk 2:3 and Isaiah 26:20, and you'll remember that in verse 27 he quoted Isaiah 26:11, the zeal of fire that will devour the adversaries. So that leads Paul's thought into merging Isaiah 26:20 with a parallel passage, Habakkuk 2:3, in this combination, which says it is a little, even a very short time, that he who comes will come and will not delay. And Paul uses the fact that Isaiah 26:20 reads similar to Habakkuk 2:3 and merges them, then to lead into Habakkuk 2:4 and his climax passage, the passage that is near in the Proem Homiletic Midrash, and says, now the just shall live by my faith, and if he is discouraged, my soul will not be pleased with him. And that word pleased in the Aramaic is actually the same word that was in Psalm 43 times, contrasting Elohim's pleasure and will with my will, and his will is the Torah. Okay? And here, the just shall live by my faith. If he is discouraged, my soul will not be pleased with him. And Elohim's pleasure is the Torah. We now know. We know from Habakkuk, from Psalm 40, that it's the Torah. And so now we better understand Habakkuk 2:4. Now the just shall live by my faith. If he is discouraged, my soul will not be pleased with him. And then the concluding, we'll look at the concluding verse, and then we'll look at something else I have here boxed for you. The concluding verse culminates Paul's point and says, "But we are not of the drawing back that leads to destruction, but of the faith that obtains for us our soul." And we now know that that faith is tied to Torah. We know because that faith is tied to the pleasure of Elohim in Habakkuk 2:4, and that is tied to the pleasure of Elohim in Psalms 47 through 9, which is defined at the end of Psalms 7 through 9 as the Torah written in our heart. Okay. So then let's talk about this key phrase here. This is the key phrase that Paul has been expounding from Habakkuk 2:4, "But the righteous shall live by his faith." We read in the Talmud in Makot 24a, "Again came Isaiah and reduced them," i.e. the precepts of the Torah, "to two principles, as it is said, Thus said the Lord, keep you justice and do righteousness. Amos came and reduced them to one principle, as it is said, For thus said the Lord unto the house of Israel, Seek you me and live. To this Rabbi Nahman ben Isaac demurred, saying, Might it not be taken as, Seek me by observing the whole Torah and live? But it is Habakkuk who came and based them all on one principle and said, But the righteous shall live by his faith." So in other words, the Talmud is telling us that Habakkuk 2:4 is a summary of the whole Torah. And then in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Habakkuk commentary, talking about their teacher of righteousness, but it does make an interesting statement here. It says the interpretation, or the pesher. We'll do a whole teaching on the pesher method of interpretation in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the future. But it's commenting upon, "And the righteous shall live," or the just shall live by his faith. The interpretation concerns all the doers of the Torah in the house of Judah, whom Elohim will save from the house of judgment because of their works and their faith in the teacher of righteousness. So now I hope that you better understand Hebrews chapter 10, and you understand that Paul in Hebrews chapter 10 is in fact illustrating the point that Habakkuk 2:4 is a summary of Torah, and the Habakkuk 2:4 is telling us that the just shall live by my faith, and if he is discouraged, my soul will not be pleased with him, because Elohim's pleasure is the Torah. And so if we have faith, then we have the Torah in our hearts, and we'll be observing Torah. And that this is referring back to what we read in Psalms 40, verses 7 through 9. Sacrifice and offerings you did not desire, they're not your pleasure. And then verse 9, I desire to do your will, O my Elohim, because your Torah is within my heart, and your Torah is his pleasure. Your Torah is his pleasure. I'm going to do your pleasure, not my pleasure. And you're going to be, therefore, not take pleasure in me if I'm not keeping Torah, and will be taking pleasure in me if I do keep Torah. If I do keep Torah, then I'm living by faith in Habakkuk 2:4, because I'm doing your will. Okay, and this is what Paul is saying in Hebrews chapter 10. He's not saying the sacrifices and offerings have been done away; they're actually part of the Torah. He is saying that that what Elohim really wants from us is Torah observance, so that sacrifices and offerings are not necessary. And therefore, he says in verse 18, which is a really good summary of his point. Now where there is forsaking of sins, an offering that is for sins is not required. By the way, in verse 18 in your handout here, I actually put the Hebrew word, the Aramaic word, shavkana, written out in English letters and in Hebrew / Aramaic letters, so that you can see it and do your own research if you like. Okay, so this is the kind of thing we do here. We're trying to look into and understand the books of the so-called New Testament, the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes, from a Jewish perspective. And what better way to do that than to examine what Paul is writing, or a portion of what Paul is writing, as it is, in the formal form of Midrash known as a Proem Homiletic Midrash. We're going to do more of these in the future, looking at some of the things that Paul teaches, Kepha teaches, or Yeshua teaches, that are actually written out in formal forms of Midrash that we would find in the rabbinic Midrashim, etc. Okay, again, I need to ask everybody to please donate to support this work. Where else do you find this kind of teaching? I think we have a very unique teaching material that we do here, and you can do that by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org, or by clicking on the donate link in the video description. By the way, for those that don't know, my wife is disabled, chronically ill, and suffers chronic pain, and I am her caretaker. So you'd be also helping us with the struggles of life in that. Okay, so we must raise $475 by the end of the day tomorrow, at the time of the making of this video, in order to keep the bank account from going into the negative tomorrow night. And that would be bad, because that creates a chain reaction of returned items and a cascade of fees. It's just not good. Okay, please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, click that notification bell, let us know what you think in the comments, discuss, participate in the discussions in the comments, share these videos with your friends on social media and email, on Facebook and relevant Facebook groups, Twitter, etc. Until next time, everybody, shalom.